Bentong Kali's name was enough to silence a crowded room. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a living nightmare whose hunger for power turned quiet streets into hunting grounds and made an entire nation tremble until the day his empire of fear finally crumbled. The name Bentong Kali carried a weight that sent shivers through towns and villages, a name whispered in fear more than spoken out loud. He was born in Benton, Pahang, and to many who knew him as a child, he seemed no different than the boys who played football on the dirt roads or wandered through crowded markets. But behind the ordinary face was a restless spirit, one that would soon take him down a road paved with violence and fear. As he grew, he gravitated toward the rough edges of society, drawn to the thrill of breaking rules and the false sense of power that came with intimidation. While others his age chased dreams of work or education, he was already chasing shadows, testing limits, and seeing how far fear could carry him. By his teenage years, he had built a reputation among peers for his temper and willingness to cross lines no one else dared. What started as petty thefts quickly turned into confrontations, and soon after, into violence. The local gangs noticed him not for his strength but for his fearlessness. He was not afraid to be seen, not afraid to challenge those who stood in his way. It was this raw energy that made him stand out in the underworld, where most criminals worked silently in the dark. Bentong Kali was different. He wanted the world to know his name, and he wanted people to remember it with fear in their voices. His rise was fueled not only by violence, but also by his ability to project an image of invincibility. He carried himself as if nothing could touch him, as if the laws that governed everyone else did not apply to him. Rumors began to circulate of the pistol he always carried, polished and ready, a weapon that gave him both confidence and control. Each time he pulled it from his waistband, the silence of the crowd around him was enough to remind him that he held power. The lines between survival, respect, and terror blurred quickly. To him, there was no difference. Power was power, no matter how it was earned. Families who once walked home at night without fear now avoided certain streets, whispering his name only in hushed tones. In coffee shops and markets, stories of his temper and unpredictability grew. Some painted him as unstoppable, others as cursed. But everyone agreed on one thing: Bentong Kali was not a man to be ignored. His path had only begun, but already, the shadow he cast stretched far beyond the town he came from. His name was becoming legend, and legends built on blood rarely fade quietly. Every criminal story has a moment where small acts of rebellion turn into crimes that can no longer be ignored, and for Bentong Kali, that turning point came faster than anyone expected. His early days of theft and intimidation were only the beginning, a warm-up for something darker that lay ahead. The first major crime that brought his name to police attention was a late-night ambush that shook the community. 2 men were killed in cold blood, and whispers spread that he had been behind it. What separated this act from his earlier violence was not only the brutality but the boldness. It was no longer about surviving on the streets or making quick money. It was about showing that he could take lives and still walk free. The police were stunned by the fearlessness of the attack. Most criminals worked hard to cover their tracks, to keep their names out of public ears. Bentong Kali did the opposite. His presence was loud, his actions almost theatrical. He wanted people to know he was the man who did it, and that no one could stop him. It was this arrogance that both terrified ordinary people and challenged the authorities. He wasn't hiding in shadows. He was daring the law to catch him, walking into bars and markets with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. Each crime that followed pushed him deeper into infamy. Robbery turned into armed robbery. Threats turned into executions. Small gangs that once laughed at his ambition now avoided his gaze, knowing that a single wrong word could mean their lives. His weapon became more than metal. It was a symbol of fear that silenced entire rooms. Where most gangsters sought money first, Bentong Kali sought dominance. To him, wealth was useless unless it came with power, and power only existed when others trembled at the mention of his name. Communities began to change under the weight of his presence. People walked faster after dark, shops closed earlier, and families warned their children not to linger outside. The sense of safety that once filled neighborhoods had vanished, replaced by the creeping awareness that danger could arrive at any moment. Police reports began to pile up, each one connected by the same chilling thread: Bentong Kali's name. And as the list of victims grew, so did his reputation. He was no longer a petty criminal, but a force of terror, and the line between man and monster was starting to blur. The scale of Bentong Kali's crimes began to stretch far beyond the neighborhoods he once terrorized. What started as isolated attacks and robberies grew into a pattern of violence spreading across state lines. Police stations from Kuala Lumpur to Selangor received reports that seemed too similar to ignore drug trafficking, violent extortion, and killings that bore the same ruthless signature. Wherever his name appeared, the aftermath was always the same: fear, silence, and blood. Communities that had never heard of him before suddenly realized they were living under the shadow of a man who thrived on chaos. He was no longer satisfied with small, opportunistic crimes. Bentong Kali's ambitions were bigger, and his methods became more organized. He wanted more than money, he wanted control. Every deal he made and every life he took was a step toward building something larger, an empire forged in fear. Those who tried to resist him were silenced quickly, their bodies left as warnings to others. Street-level dealers and small gangs soon found themselves working under his influence, not out of loyalty, but out of fear that refusing him meant certain death. His rise was as much psychological as it was physical. He didn't just kill people, he killed hope, leaving behind communities that believed no one could stop him. But his hunger for power came with a cost. The more he expanded, the more attention he drew. The police launched one of the largest manhunts in Malaysia's history, setting up roadblocks on highways, distributing wanted posters, and mobilizing units that worked day and night. His face was suddenly everywhere on the news, in newspapers, and pinned to station walls. Still, every time they thought they had him cornered, he slipped away. It was as if he always knew where the officers would strike next, vanishing minutes before raids began. This uncanny ability fueled rumors that he had inside help, perhaps corrupt officers feeding him information. The possibility made him even more untouchable in the eyes of the public. Each failed attempt to capture him only grew his legend. To ordinary people, it seemed as though he could not be caught, as if fate itself was protecting him. Fear turned into superstition, with some claiming he had charms or supernatural protection. For the police, however, it was a bitter reminder that every day he remained free was another day of danger. He wasn't just a criminal anymore. He had become a ghost that lived between fear and reality, a man whose name alone was enough to paralyze entire towns. But no empire built on violence lasts forever, and Bentong Kali's control began to show cracks the moment pressure tightened around him. With police forces intensifying their hunt and media coverage making his face impossible to ignore, he was forced into a life of constant movement. What had once been a confident stride into public spaces turned into a series of desperate hideouts, never staying in one place long enough to feel safe. Each knock on a door or sudden noise outside became a potential threat, feeding the paranoia that gnawed at him day and night. The man who once thrived on fear was now consumed by it himself. His gang, once loyal and obedient, began to scatter under the weight of his unpredictability. Living in his shadow had gone from empowering to dangerous, and many chose to disappear rather than risk sharing his fate. Former allies whispered to police in exchange for protection, while others simply abandoned him, leaving him increasingly isolated. Without the backing of his inner circle, his power weakened. The criminal network he had worked so hard to build started to collapse piece by piece, not from outside forces, but from within. The aura of invincibility that had shielded him began to fade, replaced with cracks that even his bravado could not hide. The final betrayal came from someone close. A figure who had once been trusted but who decided that survival was worth more than loyalty. A tip-off led investigators to a quiet residential area where Bentong Kali was hiding in plain sight. The location was almost ordinary, a modest home that did not match the profile of a man who had terrified an entire nation. But that ordinariness was exactly what he had counted on to protect him. For the first time, his sense of control slipped completely out of his hands. When the raid began, the silence of the neighborhood shattered under the echo of gunfire. Police surrounded the house, determined to bring down the most wanted man in Malaysia. True to his nature, Bentong Kali refused to surrender. Armed and defiant, he fired back, turning the quiet street into a battlefield. But numbers and strategy were no longer on his side. As bullets tore through the walls, his reign ended, not with quiet capture, but with a violent clash that left him lifeless inside the very place he thought would hide him. The man who had once lived untouchable was finally touched by the law. His empire reduced to dust in a matter of minutes. News of Bentong Kali's death spread across Malaysia with the speed of wildfire, but the reaction was not as simple as relief. For years, his name had been a shadow that clung to daily life, and many people found it hard to believe that the nightmare was truly over. Some refused to believe he was dead at all, insisting that someone so elusive could not have been defeated so easily. Others gathered around radios and televisions, whispering prayers of gratitude that the man who once ruled through fear was finally gone. In homes and marketplaces, the story of his end became the topic of every conversation, a mixture of disbelief, closure, and lingering fear. For the police, his death marked the conclusion of one of the most intense manhunts in the nation's history. It was a victory, but not one without scars. Countless hours, failed raids, and lives lost along the way reminded officers that bringing him down had come at a heavy cost. Yet the message was clear: no one, no matter how ruthless or feared, was beyond the reach of the law. His downfall was proof that power built on intimidation always comes with an expiration date. In the underworld, however, his legacy was more complicated. Some criminals admired his boldness, retelling stories of how he walked into bars or markets with no fear, daring anyone to stop him. To them, he was a symbol of defiance against authority, a man who lived and died on his own terms. But for most, especially the communities he terrorized, he was a reminder of the suffering and uncertainty he had caused. Mothers who once warned their children not to say his name aloud could finally exhale, though the memory of his brutality would never fully fade. Bentong Kali wanted his name to be remembered as legend, but what remained was not glory. It was a cautionary tale. His empire had been built on blood and sustained through fear, but fear alone was never enough to protect him. The same paranoia he inflicted on others had consumed him in the end, leaving him isolated and vulnerable. His story endures not as one of triumph, but as a warning about the fragility of power when it is rooted in violence. Though his body was buried, the echoes of his reign continue to haunt the streets he once ruled, a dark chapter in history that reminds everyone how quickly one man's hunger for dominance can unravel into his own destruction.